what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
With unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, since we will not be together on Halloween, I thought I'd share some spooky stories with you. And these spooky stories are all real, verbatim, and lifted directly from the Republican Party's playbook, Project 2025. The Department of Education should be eliminated. Eliminate the Head Start program. The Department of Labor should amend its hazard order regulations to permit teenage workers access to work. In other words, back to the mine, Timmy. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration should be broken up and downsized. No more weather forecasts. And finally, no public education employee shall use a name to address a student other than the name listed on a student's birth certificate. This will, of course, be a problem for James Donald Bowman, James David Hamill, J.D. Hamill, or as they now identify, J.D. Vance. This is truly scary because it is a real plan. But, Madam Speaker, I hope you and all Americans' fears are only imaginary in 2025. I yield back.
For what purpose does a gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to Mr. Casten of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. Pleasure to see you, Madam Secretary. I want to touch on a couple things, but the first, I don't know if you had a chance, and it doesn't matter if you read it or not, there was a CBO report that came out on January 18th about demographic trends in the United States. It's been rattling in my head for a while, and this I think it was 2 weeks ago, but it said, among other things, that net immigration, which some of my colleagues have mentioned, is running twice as high as was expected, and that the population of folks immigrating to the United States are, unsurprisingly, overwhelmingly of working age, 25 to 54. This sort of demographic trend that I think is the kind of thing that keeps Tucker Carlson awake at night, that our population is aging and our country is getting more diverse. But what I'm wondering if you could speak to is the conversation with Mr. Vargas. We talked about the fact that this economy is doing things that economies aren't normally supposed to do. GDP is rising. We keep creating jobs. Unemployment rates keep falling. And how much of that is directly attributable to the fact that our workforce is growing so much faster than we anticipated?
Well, part of it is due to the fact that labor force participation has increased.
I don't mean just the participation rate, though, the actual number of workers.
Yeah, I mean, partly it is immigration, but it's also, we're seeing a big pickup in adult labor force participation in the aftermath of the pandemic. Perhaps some of that, some of it is the availability of jobs, which has been amazing, and some of it is the ability to work at least partially from home, maybe drawing people into the labor force who otherwise wouldn't do so. But that's one way in which we continue. Just the last 3 months, we have an average of 290,000 jobs a month being created, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, I think about a comment that Jay Powell said, I think a year ago, that he said the growing workforce, not just workforce participation, the growing workforce was helping to rebalance the economy. I think his words was that it was tilted too much in the favor of workers. I know some workers who might disagree, but nonetheless, seems to be there. You had mentioned in your discussion with Mr. Vargas that where our growth on all these metrics, from GDP to job creation, recovery from COVID, is outpacing all of our other peers. Mentioned Japan being an exception that famously is not as open to immigration as some other countries.
That is true.
And maybe it's too soon to say this, but can you speak to what the United States has done that has led to our outperformance relative to other industrialized economies since COVID?
We have supported the economy in difficult times, and particularly the households and workers who were most affected through programs including the American Rescue Program that made sure we didn't have permanent scarring of individuals who lost their jobs and remained out of work and maybe discouraged and essentially scarred to the point where they can't participate in the workforce. We made sure People had a roof over their heads and food on the table, helped them take care of their children, provided emergency rental assistance, and then put in place a series of programs as the economy, as people got back to work, that are investing in people. The bipartisan infrastructure program, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the IRA are stimulating tremendous amount of investment and creation of good jobs, especially in parts of the country that haven't seen opportunity for a long time.
I think we've got a lot on this side of the dais and in your office, a lot to be proud of what we did to go through. And maybe we can follow up offline. When so much of the growth in working age population is from the foreign-born population, and when so much of the conversation over here on the Hill is using immigration as a political football, I want to make sure we don't cut off our nose to spite our face and understand how that contributes.
I agree. I think it's been a plus.
I see I'm out of time. I had wanted to follow up with you on the FIO and climate risk, but I'll follow up with you offline on that one. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman, Mr. Casten, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all for being here. So I remember when I got out of college, I was living in Boston when I was in my 20s, mostly just reading the Federalist Papers. But I remember there was this great pizza restaurant over on Commonwealth Avenue by BU that rather famously the pizza was fantastic, to be clear. They were found to have basically retained virtually every law firm in Boston, and they would hire young lawyers to go make deposits at banks that were often just below the levels that would trigger AML requirements, but if they were above, the FBI office was full of pictures of young aspiring lawyers whose firms had all been completely conflicted out of ever working against the owners of said pizza restaurant. Nobody would have ever argued that the beneficial use case for this particular pizza restaurant meant that we should never regulate pizza restaurants under AML protocols. And I get concerned in this DeFi conversation that we're framing this as it's beneficial use. It's really good. It's maybe as good as the pizza that was at this pizza joint. And therefore, we shouldn't have anti-money laundering rules. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Mr. Hayes, you'd mentioned the UkiDao case, where my understanding is that UkiDao was actually advertising that that you could get around AML laws, and CFTC has come after them, had alleged that they were actually created with the explicit goal of operating an illegal trap form. So I guess, Mr. Van Valkenburg and Mr. Tuminelli, I'm just curious, yes or no, because I don't want to misunderstand your testimony. Is it your argument that if a DeFi protocol is found to be violating anti-money laundering rules, should there be any legal accountability to the creators, the operators, the people maintaining that service? Just yes or no. Should those people have any legal liability?
Those who are not decentralized, those who are custodial, have AML laws that apply, and they should be applied, and they should be enforced.
If it's a DeFi protocol, are you saying that we're saying it's decentralized?
An immutable smart contract that I transact with?
I'm just asking yes or no. Should they have
As
somebody wrote the
an
code?
American transacting with a mutable smart contract, I'm transacting with my own funds. I should not be subject to the Bank Secrecy
Okay, so
Act.
you think no, Ms. Tuminelli, you think yes or no? Should there be any liability that's there?
I think bad actors should be held liable for the bad conduct that they engage in. Not the developers, not the people who created the software. It's the bad actors who actually committed the crime. We should go after
So
them.
there should be no liability for the people who created the tool. So back to my pizza example. The people made the pizza joint. They used these laws. There should be no liability for them because they're just pizza. They're just pizza producers.
If I make a neutral tool that somebody uses to
Okay.
commit crime, I should not be held responsible for that person's conduct.
Okay, Mr. Hayes, that's bizarre. I mean, that's aiding and abetting commission of a felony. Mr. Hayes, who do you think should be held liable in those cases? Is it the DAO members? Is it the creators? Is it where should that liability lie?
I think it's a good question. It's complex, but I think you can apply existing laws to find some answers. I think it also depends on the facts and circumstances of those cases. But I think what you're raising raises a conundrum. Developers and admins intervene in the platforms that facilitate these transactions on a fairly regular basis, either directly or indirectly through the functions of the DAO. They update the code, they issue assets, they help determine how the validation process works. There are many times when interventions happen by individuals with knowledge. Those include people outside of the developer team and inside the developer team. And it's tricky because why are they intervening in those moments when not only are those about the infrastructural operation of the platform, but actually what the platform does, which is to facilitate transactions and move assets. Why then should they not be held accountable if the transactions that they help facilitate end up facilitating illicit finance? So I would argue that you have to find a way to hold developers accountable to some degree, and the question is, where do you draw that line?
Okay, so I want to get back, because I think we talk about this technology as being unique and not recognize that we have, to your point, we have these tools. If I buy a security on NASDAQ, I have to disclose, and NASDAQ has clearing offices, and they verify the identity, and I guess, Ms. Rettig, coming to you, following on your exchange with Mr. Foster, in the case of a NASDAQ transaction, there is a clear custody title that is clear. There is no way to participate in that as an anonymous actor. Is there any reason why we could not insist on those rules for DeFi protocols? And if you want to be anonymous, if you want to think you can duck rules, fine, you can't play in this sandbox.
I think it goes to actually what Mr. von Valkenburg talked about in his oral testimony, which would be importing intermediaries into disintermediated systems, which will put the U.S. at a large-scale disadvantage from a long-term perspective.
Look, I'm out of time, but there is no disadvantage to the U.S. economy of not protecting the interests of child traffickers, money launderers, and the North Korean nuclear system.
The one point on your pizza example is that the pizza restaurant had individuals who were acting with scienter, and that's very different than what's going on here.
Has expired.
Yield back. Mr. Chairman, Secretary Fudge, nice to see you again. Thanks for coming back. I don't know, there's something ironic about having folks across the aisle criticize you for how well you're doing your job when we're 8 days away from a shutdown, because we still haven't even brought bills to the floor to fund government 4 months after the fiscal year ended. And I guess I just say that because we may need some of your housing help, because there's a whole lot of people throwing stones inside glass houses on the other side of this aisle, and we're gonna have some disrepair in those glass houses. But let me move to more substantive points. In 2021, HUD released your climate action plan, and that plan cited research from Johns Hopkins that said that banks are shifting riskier mortgages, including those in coastal areas, off their books and over to the federal government, warned of a potential threat to the stability of financial institutions due to climate change leading to more extreme disasters. I think the department said that your loan guarantee programs could be particularly at risk from climate change because of physical damage, disruptions in borrowers' ability to pay, declining property values. Do you have any sense of what specific states or regions are most exposed to those risks?
Well, certainly those who are near large bodies of water. We have fires all over the West that are created by climate change. I think that any coastal community is at high risk. I can't give you the exact numbers, but that's what we are finding and seeing. I mean, there are some instances where we saw a tornado in Kansas. We had storms in New Jersey. I mean, it is the nature of where we are in the world with climate. Everybody's having climate challenges, and we are no different.
So a geographic concentration. I want to talk a little bit about risk pricing, because it strikes me, and I'm sure you felt the same in your current role and back when you were a lowly member of Congress like us schmoes up here. There's this tension between, do we accurately price risk, particularly when we need a social safety net and need to make sure that folks are covered. And some of the reporting that's come out of your agency, has come out of the CFTC, is seeing this risk being shifted onto bodies that are maybe legally not allowed to price risk. There was this story this week that Florida, of all places, is considering socializing their property insurance, because they're not willing to let insurers factor in forward risk pricing, because that would be politically risky, but now insurers are leaving the state. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, in addition to the geographic risks, are there certain states or places where, or even pockets of the economy where you think the risk is going to be mispriced in such a way that there's going to be some exposure and financial disruption in the economy?
Well, and I'm not sure I'm answering it, but let me suggest that most times when we have major climate crises, they affect the poorest people in our country. When we are talking about how we insure people against these kinds of storms and whatever they may be, what we're talking about is the richest people in the country. The poorest people are the ones who tend to be underinsured or uninsured, whose homes are not built to the standards they should be, who live in areas that are closest to damage. I'm not sure, am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's what I'm trying to understand, and this is maybe way too philosophical a question for 5 minutes, much less the 60 seconds I have left, is where does the risk end up in this system? Because we have, we oversee financial regulators who monitor the stability of our banks. But if the bank can move it onto the insurance company, well, we saw it in 2008 with AIG. All of a sudden, that's outside the regulator's purview until it becomes a larger problem. And if the risk is moving on to taxpayers or moving on to, the economically least among us, where does that risk pool that we as regulators should be saying, we can see the risk pooling in that area, let's take proactive measures now while it's relatively easy, rather than waiting until we're in a 2008 financial crisis again?
Well, one thing, we have to do something with the insurance companies, because there are states they will not insure it. But in the states that they do, you see rising premiums, rising deductibles, to the point where people can't afford to do it, especially in places where they have not had these kinds of occurrences in the past. But now we're having 100-year storms every year. Yeah. We're doing things that are creating an environment in which the average person cannot afford to insure their homes. And I'm not sure if I'm still answering your question. Maybe it is a little philosophical.
Let's continue the conversation. It's this broader issue of climate financial risk. I think our committee can and should do a better job of addressing, and welcome your thoughts on how to do it. Yield back.
Recognition.
Madam Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1,
the House will suspend. Members, please direct your conversations off the floor. The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House.
The gentleman is recognized.
The form of the resolution is as follows. House Resolution, directing the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives to release to the public the committee's report on its investigation into allegations against former Representative Matt Gaetz. Whereas, on April 9th, 2021, the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives announced that it had begun to review allegations that Representative Matt Gaetz may have engaged in sexual misconduct and illicit drug use, shared inappropriate images or videos on the House floor, misused state identification records, converted campaign funds for personal use, and accepted a bribe, improper gratuity, or impermissible gift in violation of the rules of the House, laws, or other standards of conduct. Whereas the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives has completed its review into the allegations pursuant to Committee Rules 14A3 and 18A that Representative Gaetz may have engaged in sexual misconduct and illicit drug use, accepted improper gifts, dispensed special privileges and favors to individuals with whom he had a personal relationship, and sought to obstruct government investigations into his conduct. Whereas, on November 13th, 2024, President-elect Donald Trump announced his nomination of former Representative Matt Gaetz to serve as Attorney General. Whereas, on November 13th, 2024, Representative Matt Gaetz announced his resignation from Congress. Whereas, there is precedent for the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives to release reports on former members of the House of Representatives should information in those reports remain relevant to the function of Congress. Whereas, the decision by the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives not to release the report on its investigation into the serious allegations against former Representative Matt Gaetz impedes the ability of the Senate to provide advice and consent on this nomination. And whereas a failure of the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives to release its report on its investigation impedes the dignity and integrity of the legislative proceedings of the House. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Committee on Ethics of the House of Representatives shall immediately release to the public of the committee's report on its investigation into allegations against former Representative Matt Gaetz, including any conclusions, recommendations, attachments, or accompanying material.
A resolution offered from the floor by a member other than the majority leader or minority leader as a question of the privileges of the House has immediate precedence only at a time designated by the chair within 2 legislative days after the resolution is properly noticed. Pending that designation, the form of the resolution noticed by the gentleman from Illinois will appear in the record at this point. The chair will not at this point determine whether the resolution constitutes a question of privilege. That determination will be made at the time designated for consideration of the resolution.
Mr. Speaker, last month, Congresswoman DeLauro and I, along with Senators Van Hollen and Durbin, led over 80 congressional Democrats to urge the Biden administration to impose financial sanctions on certain members of the Netanyahu government, specifically Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir for their role in the rise of settler violence, settlement expansion, and the general destabilization of the West Bank. I represent one of the largest Palestinian populations in the United States. I've had constituents who have lost loved ones, have had family land seized, and even as American citizens have been detained in Israeli prisons simply for the crime of visiting their families. I am also a staunch supporter of Israel and categorically support their right to defend themselves and recover hostages taken during the horrific acts of October 7th. And let us be very clear. There is no conflict between supporting the nation of Israel and the dignity of the Palestinian people, so long as you are committed to a permanent and durable regional peace in this lifetime. And that peace will never be realized until people on both sides of the Green Line have equal property rights, security, and opportunity. Now, that's not possible as long as Israeli hostages are being detained or as rockets continue to fly into Israel from Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. But it's also not possible as long as Palestinians in the West Bank are having their property confiscated, livestock killed, and their communities bulldozed. Violent settlers in the West Bank have carried out almost 1,300 known attacks against Palestinians since October 7th. At least 25 new outposts have been established. 70 illegal outposts were recognized and are eligible for funding by the Israeli government. All of these actions are illegal under international law. Earlier this year, President Biden issued Executive Order 14115 that authorized the imposition of sanctions on anyone determined to be, quote, responsible for, complicit in, or to have directly or indirectly engaged or attempted to engage in actions that threaten the peace, security, or stability of the West Bank. To date, President Biden has used this order to sanction Palestinian militant groups, organizations involved in violent extremist activity, instigators from the settler movement, and the outposts from which violent attacks are launched. But just as it is appropriate for Israel to target Hamas leadership in their response to October 7th, it is necessary for the United States to target financial sanctions on the leaders of the extremist settler movement. Which brings us to Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They have distributed rifles to extremists. They have allowed those extremists to attack humanitarian aid convoys. They have prevented the Palestinian Authority from accessing the international banking network. These ministers' stated goal is the annexation of the West Bank, and they have acted in ways that violate both the spirit and the letter of the President's executive order. Frederick Douglass famously said that the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins, and he, her worst enemy, who seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend those sins under the specious garb of patriotism. It is out of love for the Palestinian people and a deep, abiding friendship with Israel that we must now rebuke Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir for their sins. I urge President Biden to heed the calls of over 80 members of Congress and use his executive order to issue these sanctions and to help put a stop to settler violence in the West Bank. I yield back.
Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a former CEO who would have personally benefited from this legislation, and I rise in strong, dare I say, vehement opposition to this legislation. Let me be very clear. The job of a CEO, especially in capital-intensive businesses like the one I used to run, is to be a prudent and responsible steward of other people's capital. I should also be candid that sometimes investors can be a pain in the butt. When you're the CEO, you're managing their money, they may call you and they may ask questions about wanting to dig into the details of your hiring policies. Maybe they want to dig into the details of your internal governance policies. Maybe they want to understand the degree to which your company is hedged out against future risks, ESG or otherwise. It is very tempting in those moments, I say from personal experience, as a CEO to say, you all don't understand this business as well as I do. I am so much smarter than you. I'm going to ignore your questions because they are not material and hang up the phone. That is a great way to become an ex-CEO, which is exactly as it should be, because when you tell them that you don't understand what I know about my company, they are inclined to correct you and say, no, no, it's not your company, it's my company. You all are doing exactly that with this bill. You are telling investors, shareholders, that they do not have a right to decide what is material in their interest in these companies. Maybe that's an individual investor, maybe that's a pension fund. You're saying that they don't matter. Let me tell you, our nation's CEOs, thank you for your service. Thank you for looking out for them. Now, we will always have a few lousy, self-interested CEOs who would like to fleece their investors, who would like to hide their liabilities, who would like to tell you to shut up and pound sand because you don't understand their business. It is sad to me to see the Republican Party choose to associate with them and say we have your back. But I'm proud to stand with our nation's good CEOs, and more importantly, with all of our nation's investors, in strong opposition to this anti-market, anti-growth legislation. I yield back.
Gentlelady
I
reserved.
reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a former CEO who would have personally benefited from this legislation, and I rise in strong, dare I say, vehement opposition to this legislation. Let me be very clear. The job of a CEO, especially in capital-intensive businesses like the one I used to run, is to be a prudent and responsible steward of other people's capital. I should also be candid that sometimes investors can be a pain in the butt. When you're the CEO, you're managing their money, they may call you and they may ask questions about wanting to dig into the details of your hiring policies. Maybe they want to dig into the details of your internal governance policies. Maybe they want to understand the degree to which your company is hedged out against future risks, ESG or otherwise. It is very tempting in those moments, I say from personal experience, as a CEO to say, you all don't understand this business as well as I do. I am so much smarter than you. I'm going to ignore your questions because they are not material and hang up the phone. That is a great way to become an ex-CEO, which is exactly as it should be, because when you tell them that you don't understand what I know about my company, they are inclined to correct you and say, no, no, it's not your company, it's my company. You all are doing exactly that with this bill. You are telling investors, shareholders, that they do not have a right to decide what is material in their interest in these companies. Maybe that's an individual investor, maybe that's a pension fund. You're saying that they don't matter. Let me tell you, our nation's CEOs, thank you for your service. Thank you for looking out for them. Now, we will always have a few lousy, self-interested CEOs who would like to fleece their investors, who would like to hide their liabilities, who would like to tell you to shut up and pound sand because you don't understand their business. It is sad to me to see the Republican Party choose to associate with them and say we have your back. But I'm proud to stand with our nation's good CEOs, and more importantly, with all of our nation's investors, in strong opposition to this anti-market, anti-growth legislation. I yield back.
Gentlelady
I
reserved.
reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Casten, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. You know, I'm struck that this hearing reminds me of what I've long felt about this job, that the single loneliest position in Washington, D.C. is to be an advocate for competitive markets. There is not a single business who comes to Washington, who pays their lobbyists, who pays the budget of the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute to say, can you please make my market safer for competitors? Can you please lower barriers to entry, lower barriers to exit, increase transparency of information? Nobody does that. And let none of us in this room ever trust someone who claims to be pro-market when all they're really doing is to try to protect the power of the powerful. I say that just to say, let's be honest here as we get into this. Mr. Burton, I am quite certain you and I disagree on whether the SEC's climate disclosure rule was a good idea, but hopefully you do agree that the Commission did in fact receive significant public feedback and made adjustments in response to that feedback. Yes, I see you nodding your head.
Oh,
yes.
Definitely. They got a lot of comments.
Good, okay. Because I know that, you know, I saw that you said that they had the draft rule, in your opinion, would have raised costs by 300%. Now you think it's 20%. Setting aside whether I agree with that, that sounds like significant change. They did, in fact, respond to a lot of comments, make adjustments in response to a stakeholder process. Let's not forget that. Ms. Schulp, in a podcast you did last week, you said that companies already provide a ton of voluntarily disclosed financial information. I just want to be clear, that's not consistently described, right? They don't have a standard format. They're providing this in ways that they choose to describe, correct?
I was referring to climate-specific financial.
Yes, but they are not providing that in a consistent format.
Unless it is information that they're providing
Or
in SEC filings.
Which doesn't exist yet, right? Because we don't actually mandate consistent formats. So, Ms. Thornton, can you please educate our economically moderately literate members in the room why basic economics, why competitive markets, why investor protection demands that we provide consistent, accurate information?
Because if you don't standardize it somehow and make a format, investors may not be able to find it. If you don't tag the information, investors may not be able to find it in the voluminous 10Ks that are filed. And that information needs to be in a format where an investor can compare it 1 year to the next, so it's consistently reported from 1 year to the next, so the investor can see whether the company is making progress on the commitment that it made about reducing its emissions or whatever.
And isn't that true for all accounting? Like, I mean, look, there's probably businesses who could make more money if they didn't have to comply with GAAP accounting.
Correct.
Right? It would probably be cheaper for them if they didn't have to have audited financials, wouldn't it?
Probably, but
Does anybody think we should not have GAAP accounting? I mean, my God, we're complaining that there's a cost of providing information. Free markets are awesome. Sing it from the rafters. I hope that's not partisan someday. Let me talk about a couple things here just for the record. In 2020, the Trump Commodity Future Trading Corporation issued a report managing climate risk in the financial sector that said, and I quote, "Climate change poses a major risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system. Regulators and financial institutions need reliable, consistent, and comparable data and projection for climate risk exposure sensitivity." That was the Trump White House. 2021 report from FSOC said that climate change is an emerging threat to the U.S. financial system. I could go on. Show of hands. Raise your hand if you agree that climate risk can pose a significant risk to the U.S. financial system. Only the Democrats raise their hand. That is freaking insane, people. You're going to deny. Let me remind you, insurers are pulling out of Florida. They are pulling out of Louisiana. They're pulling out of Texas. Who is California? Who is left holding the bag? Those are billions of dollars, and we're going to somehow deny that this is real. Look, I get it. You're protecting the interests of the powerful. Those of us up here have to represent everybody. Mr. Burton, I understand that you are one of the authors of Project 2025, which provides a, quote, conservative blueprint for the next Republican president. Yes, that's true?
I was a co-author of the Treasury chapter and the author of the SEC chapter.
That is massively irresponsible. I want to just point out, in the time I've left, Richard Nixon created the EPA. Ronald Reagan's EPA said we need to use the markets to price environmental externalities. That led to the Montreal Protocol, a global agreement on pollution control. George H.W. Bush's White House extended that to the acid rain trading program. Do not be an embarrassment to the party of Nixon, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reagan, the economic profession.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
I'd be happy to talk to you.
Just say that I would caution all members of this committee to maintain the decorum that has always been consistent in the Financial Services Committee.
Will the gentlelady yield?
The gentleman, I absolutely will not. I would like all to remain decorum, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for 5 minutes.